See the sun shines in my face, but I'm not going to be turning that away, having had such a frosty start for the last few days. Kind of shocked us a little bit, I think. A lot of people know me as Nina Aouilk, the activist. I'm an activist. I speak out against honour-based killings. I'm a TEDx and professional speaker. I'm a best-selling author. But one thing I am is a mindset coach for fighters, which we'll go on to later on at the end of this webinar. I was really happy to be asked to speak today because from a perspective of a survivor of gender-based violence and other cultural crimes, as I call them, it's not something that you can read in a textbook. I only started speaking out a couple of years ago. My first talk was my TED talk, which I'd love for you all to check out at some point. And the reason I spoke out is because I understood that we have almost a job to do as a survivor who needs to speak out so that other people understand firsthand how it feels, why things happen, maybe why we put up with things. And also for those other girls and women that are struggling and suffering in silence, which I know they still are. My story goes way back. I'm a lot older than I may look to you, but it goes way back to the 1970s, which is when I was born in 1970. I was born into a family who originate from the north of India, so they are Punjabi, Indian. The religion has nothing to do with the way they treated me. It's very much predominantly the way that they knew. I describe my parents as packing very tightly in their suitcases, their traditions and their cultural beliefs, because when you're leaving, it must be quite traumatic in itself. I know packing to go away for a few days, I'm always thinking, have I packed this and have I packed that? It's quite a big rush to get everything that you need. So for them, they had to take with them what they felt was of value. And to them, their values were the way they had been taught, the way they had been programmed almost to live a good life, and also how to look at people and treat them also. Being born a girl was not pleasant for me because my parents showed from birth that they didn't want me. I was left in my pushchair for days. Nobody would pick me up. My auntie told me that when she came over to pick me up, which is the natural thing when you go to visit a newborn, my mother sort of shunned her and shunned anybody else that came near the pushchair. And after a few days of crying, I realized nobody was coming, and I entertained myself, and I was quite a happy child, apparently. My memories, my first memories go back to being 6 years old. I was, as I would describe it now, I understand, a domestic servant, because no 6-year-old child should be doing the jobs that I was doing. I was kept in my bedroom. I wasn't allowed to interact with my family. The communication was non-verbal. Why did I not question this? I've been asked before. Or why didn't I tell somebody at school? Why didn't I tell the 1 or 2 friends I had? And the reason is fear, that 4-letter word that keeps you from even thinking for yourself. And that fear that had been instilled within me kept me from understanding what reality was, what normality was. I wasn't allowed to watch television, so I had no way of integrating with Western culture other than the short time I was at school. So for me, this was normality. The growing up in this manner, coming downstairs when called upon to cook and clean was the normal thing for me, as it was for a lot of Asian girls and girls from Africa, girls from the Middle East, and the Latino community is very similar too. Things went on as they were. You know, I was growing up, doing really well at school because I was a people pleaser, because that habitual thing was instilled in me to try to please people so they would accept me, so they would like me, because I had absolutely zero self-worth. I didn't understand that I should be looked after and cared for as a child. I took it as the normality that I wasn't to be treated very well or spoken to in a loving way. I always say that one thing my mother and father taught me was how not to be a parent, because I knew that I didn't want any of those things for my own children. So it's a case of how you take things away from it. I went on to developing as young women do. My father was an ex-professional wrestler, very popular. And back in the 80s, dads would go out to the local pubs and they would bring back with them their friends, often intoxicated, very loud. But because the pubs would close at a certain time, they would drink at somebody else's house. And it happened to be our house. I knew these people from 7 years, I would say, because as I was growing up, they were the same set of uncles, as we call them, but they're not related to us. In my culture, we don't say an elder's name, so we call everybody uncle or auntie out of respect. And on one particular occasion, when my father came back with my uncles, so to speak, my job was always to wake up, whether it was 1 o'clock in the morning, whether it was 12 o'clock. Whenever I got that nudge from my mother, I knew that it was my turn to go downstairs and cook and clean, and to serve them their food and wait until they'd eaten and clear up, and then I could sleep. On this particular occasion, I had just come on to developing as a young woman. I was 14 now, I was growing up, so I had all of the hormonal changes going on. We don't talk about periods in my culture. We don't talk about the changes that a girl goes through. It's very shunned upon to even mention the word period or sex in my culture. So a lot of the things I was learning was either from school or guessing, because we didn't have Google in those days. And even the schools didn't talk about periods as much as they do now. I cooked my father and his friends a meal that day and sat on the bottom step of a large wooden cold staircase waiting for them to finish. And on this occasion, as I describe it, I instinctively knew that something didn't feel right, because we, I believe, have this messaging servicing within our bodies that tells us when things are not right, or like a warning signal, almost like traffic lights, you know, that red light comes on. Often we'll ignore it and we'll go on and do something, and later on say, well, I should have known better because I knew it didn't feel right. But as 14, I didn't really know what options I had. I knew that I had to wait and I had to do as I was told, otherwise it would lead to a severe beating. It would lead to punishments, as my parents punished me. And I did as I was told. But when I went in to clear the dishes, when I was called, the first person to grab me was my father. And he threw me onto the table where the dishes were and raped me. And that was the first of the evening, because his friends raped me after, and the night continued into a very traumatic evening of abuse. I woke up in the morning because my mother actually opened the door and slammed it, and she opened it again and slammed it, wanting for me to get up. And as I looked down, I saw that I was laying in almost a bath of blood, and my body was covered with cuts and bruises, because it wasn't a rape per se, it was more of a frenzied attack. And the level of abuse, physical abuse, was paramount, and I could barely move from the hurt and the pain. I obviously got up, and as the days went on, my body started to heal, but I mentally couldn't heal. So instead of being that child who would run to the front of the class to please her teachers, I was that child hiding, sitting on the floor, often sitting in the back. And the teachers didn't really pick up on this. I later on got pregnant, and my parents arranged for an abortion at a private clinic, which was in the Midlands. That's all I can remember, really. And I remember the procedure, I remember everything. But after this procedure, they ask you to go and sit on a grass verge. I wasn't alone. There were many other people there, a lot older than I was. And as I sat there, I remember a lady coming to me and stroking my hair, and she handed me a cup of tea with a biscuit. And I thought, wow, that was the first sign of kindness anybody had ever shown me. It was the first time somebody had touched me in a loving way. And it made me consider that maybe I wasn't as bad as my parents had taught me to believe. I'd been told I was a bad spirit, an evil spirit, a witch, and that I carried around with me a lot of dark energy. And that was the reason that nobody loved me and that I was unlovable. And I believed that, I really did. But when this lady did what she did, she changed the dynamics of my thinking in a way that maybe I wasn't as bad as I had been led to believe. The fact that I had lost my virginity caused a huge problem, and my family were worried about who they could marry me to. There was talk of me being sent to India. There was talk of me being killed. And my father kept saying that I had brought shame upon his honor, which I didn't understand because I hadn't actually physically done anything myself. But I believed again what he told me, because when you are such a young, naive mind, you're malleable and you believe everything that you are told. And I did believe what he was telling me. I believed I was good for nothing. I believed I was the cause of a lot of problems, that if only I'd been born a girl, or if only I'd been born into an English family, it may have been different. And I decided to take my life. So I took some paracetamols. In those days, we had tubs, not packets. And I didn't know what I was doing again, but I figured I would just take them and fall asleep. But the internal chest pain it caused was really bad. I didn't die, and my parents found me and beat me again for trying to kill myself, which confused me because I thought maybe they want me to live. And it was that constant conflict in my own mind as to whether I belonged or I didn't. My father kept literally crying out that there was such a huge weight on his shoulders with regards to me being the girl and my dignity, he kept calling it. And one of the evenings that I remember, he was on the phone, because I had this habit of listening into everything because I was in my room and I was wanting to be part of the family. He seemed a lot happier and he said, thank you to somebody on the other end of the phone. And then I heard them saying that everything's going to be okay, and that gave me a little bit of relief, not really knowing what okay was. I realised when I was called downstairs abruptly one evening and taken into the same room in which I was raped, which is known as the guest room, that something was very wrong again. I was sat down on the sofa, a red chunni, as we call it, which is like a veil, was put on my head, and an engagement process started. It was a promising of my hand in marriage to somebody. I didn't know who the somebody was. One of the perpetrators that had raped me was there with his wife, and they seemed very involved in this engagement process. Keeping my eyes down, I was relying on what I was hearing to let me know what my outcome was, what my decisions were being made for my future. And I discovered that one of the perpetrators had come forward with a solution, and that was that he would take my hand in marriage for his son, not him, but his son. His son was actually seeing somebody who was white British, which was not allowed by our culture. So to look like he was marrying somebody in the culture, this was a solution. So it was a sham wedding. And I would go into that house and I would be treated in the same way I was treated in my parents' house, as a servant. That's what I was told. My father bartered with this guy about what should be given. Money was exchanged. He was asking for washing machines, which were quite expensive in those days, and asking for microwaves and gold. And this hour, I think it took probably more than an hour, negotiation continued while I sat there just wanting to sink into the sofa and disappear. When I was sent to my room, I was violently sick. I didn't know what was going to happen because I now feared being raped again, and I wondered if he would invite his friends to his house and they would rape me continuously. So this form of abuse I felt was going to follow me, and the fear was crippling. It really was. I did get married. When I turned 15, I was told I was getting married, but it was delayed because he had a daughter to marry and you have to wait traditionally. So we waited, and I think I was married at 16. I was there for 4 years. Every day I was pushing him off me. I was being abused sexually or raped. I was given a small room downstairs when everybody slept upstairs, and my room was literally the size of a cupboard. My job was to cook and clean and to do the laundry and to look after them the way I had looked after my parents. I had an eating disorder, and to make it further worse, anytime I tried to plate my food, my mother-in-law would take me to the bin and put the plate of food into the bin and tell me to eat out of the bin, which was soul destroying and made me just not want to eat. I was tied by my ankles by metal coat hangers and left naked as a form of punishment. Again, that was just a control thing to instill fear. Little did they know that I wouldn't have moved if they told me to stay in one place, because I was so fearful. I didn't even cry because I felt that they would see the tracks of my tears and know that I'd been crying and punish me. So I would literally internalize any pain or trauma that I felt. I went on to getting a very good job at the age of 16, 17 because they wanted me to work. That was to their detriment, because I started to discover conversations with people from different cultures, mainly the white British culture, and started to understand that it wasn't okay for them to treat me in such a bad way. I made friends with a couple from work who were, he was African and she was Punjabi, Sikh, like myself, Indian. So I felt I had a connection with her, and she said to me that if you go back to your parents, they will love you because they're your parents, right? And it's almost as though I'd erased my childhood, not understanding that they were not going to want me. I'd romanticized that I would go home and be pulled in by loving arms and be looked after. Because I was 21 now, I was older, a lot of time had passed, and I guess that's what you want for yourself sometimes, so you imagine that's going to happen. I decided one day at work that I was not going to go back to my marital home, and I found myself on a bus traveling back to my parents, trying to figure out which words to say, having this conversation in my own head. Before I even got to the house, my parents knew I was coming, because in my culture, you didn't need mobile phones in those days. If an auntie saw you, she was on the home number telling them that I've just seen your daughter, she's on a bus, she's not going to her in-laws, she's coming to see you. And when a girl gets married in my culture, often you don't see them again, because they are now the property of the people into which family she's married. And that was what I was told. I hadn't seen my father or family for 4 years. I didn't hate my family. All I ever had was love for them, because I'd forgiven them for the things they had done, and people don't understand that. If I call them good parents, people come down on me like a ton of bricks and say they're not good parents. But what I want to explain is that if you only know a certain type of living or culture or a belief system that girls are bad, boys are good, then you will do what you do because of what you believe. Now, what they did to me was very wrong. I don't condone that. I hold them accountable. And I know very much that it's all very wrong, which is why I'm an activist speaking out against these hideous crimes that are committed behind closed doors. But the way I am full of love. And I just wanted to say that I went back thinking that they were like me in a way, that they would want to love me. Otherwise, it makes no complete sense, but you don't think logically when you're of such low self-worth and in the position that I was in, which was very desperate. I had no one to turn to. There was no indication of women's rights in those days or help, especially for someone from a culture similar to mine. When I stood at my father's door, he opened it, and I instinctively knew that I'd made it one of the biggest mistakes of my life. He grabbed me by my hair and pulled me in, and a barrage of insults started from that moment of me being a prostitute, a bad omen, that I had brought disgrace upon his face because of the community and what they would be saying, that the shame that he felt for having a girl like me. And that was something he would say throughout my childhood, that you are just a girl, and having a girl like you makes me feel this, it makes me feel that. And he said that nobody would speak to him. All of the respect he had spent so long building in the community was lost, that I would have been better off dead than stood at their door. And they started to beat me, but this beating was nothing like I'd ever had in my life, and I had been beaten many a time. This beating was one of vengeance, pure hatred and anger. And they broke my arm, they broke my jaw, and I was quite a feeble 21-year-old. And as I collapsed, they stamped upon me and kicked me, and my father had his foot on my throat. And it was at that moment I felt I had left my body, which is difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't had that experience, but it's almost a very calming, beautiful experience of just being. And I could see myself there, completely crushed and broken, like a pile of almost despair and desperate sadness. And something said to me, not yet. And I remember going back into that body and watching the blood drip off my nose into the carpet. I could no longer feel them kicking or punching me, but I knew they were doing it. Excuse me. I looked up to see my mother, who had her arms crossed and was very angry. And she was adding into the honor killing by saying things about how she felt about me, which was not good. My other brother walked in and said that you can't kill her here. Not here, we have to send her to India. And it was very strange because they suddenly stopped and walked away. But I felt physically they'd exhausted themselves too. And I think that they just couldn't give any more. I was in and out of consciousness for a couple of days. I could barely move my arms. I had soiled myself in the same place that I lay. And somebody from my mum's friends, one of my mum's friends, put a head around the door and said, they're sending you to India. When you get to the airport, ask for help. And it dawned on me that if I'd got to the airport, I wouldn't ask for help. If I had my mother on one side and my father on the other, or my mother and brother, or whoever it was, I knew that I would be too scared. And I asked myself for the first time in my life if I wanted to live. And for some reason, I wanted to live. I didn't know why, but I did. I heard them put on an Indian film, and Indian films last for about 3.5 hours. So I knew they were busy, and I tried to get up, but I couldn't because I was physically in so much pain. But I kept telling myself that this was my only chance, that this was my window of opportunity. And if I didn't take it, then I would just be killed. And I started to crawl like a baby. I would fall, I would crawl, I would fall. I was trying to stay quiet, and I felt like I was making a lot of noise. There was a house full of angry people, and it would take just one wrong movement to get their attention. People don't believe this happened because they say, well, how can you move if you have broken bones? And the miracle of it was when I got to my garden, I looked at my dog who came out of nowhere, and she was the loudest person in the house, and I begged her not to say anything. And I feel animals and young children have this instinctive knowledge of when someone's in pain, because she didn't say a word. She just looked at me. And then she looked up at the fence because it's almost as though she knew what I was trying to do. I had a damaged hip, but somehow I had spoken myself to a point where I believed I could get over this fence. And I did, and I escaped, and I passed out in a small park which was opposite the house. I woke up in the small hours of the morning, to which I then escaped to a taxi rank, who I believe was one of the angels that was sent my way to give me a hand. He got me to safety. I went to my friend's house who wasn't there. So I went to the police station. The police station took photos. They took a report. And then when I said it was an honour killing, he almost shunned me and sent me to a hospital. I lay in a hospital bed for nearly 2 months, Kettering Hospital in Northamptonshire. And people would visit other people around in the same ward, but nobody would speak to me. The nurses didn't ask me what had happened. No one thought it was unusual that I was a young woman with nobody visiting. And when I was released from the hospital, I was put into a women's hostel, which I couldn't deal with because a lot of women were dealing with their own trauma and turning to alcohol and substances to numb their pain. But I didn't understand at that time. I wasn't aware or emotionally strong enough to understand their pain. Excuse me. I ended up going back to my friend's house, who said that he'd split up with my friend, but he had a spare room and I could stay there if I paid rent. So I thought, this is a miracle. I'm going to be paid rent, going to be able to stay somewhere. All I need to do is find the rent. And I got myself a job in Kettering Council. And I thought life was starting to go a certain way. I felt happier. My parents were looking for me, but they didn't know where to find me. My landlord, as I call him, because he was subletting to me, he was my friend, but he was quite distant and I didn't really understand why, but I didn't know any different to me. It was it was something I recognised. It was a familiarity with his mannerisms and his abruptness. So I didn't question his behaviour. And one day we went to a party and I thought, wow, I'm going to a party I've never been. And said he was giving me Coke to drink. I said it tasted strange. He said it's Pepsi, not Coke. And I was very believing and naive. And I got drunk from the real drink that he was serving me, which was Malibu and Coke. I don't remember very much about that evening. I know later on that he'd raped me and I was pregnant. And suddenly I had a decision to make if I wanted this child. I felt like it was a gift from God that I would have something for me, which was selfish, maybe. And when my daughter was born, I had never felt such love. She'd broken that cycle of not celebrating a daughter. And I promised to give her everything I never had. So I decided to work really hard and create everything that I had wanted as a child: a nice house to live, somewhere for her to play. I ended up buying a house with my now partner, and he could see that I was very entrepreneurial because I started a business. I started a business from the house, selling mobile phones, which was doing so well that we ended up moving it into a commercial property, which I also bought the property then, and things were going really well. I had my second child and he was a son, and my partner seemed really happy. Life was progressing. My father was trying to find my daughter. He dressed up in a wig and come with my brothers to abduct her when she was first born, and offered money to the landlord that was renting to us, who told me, and that was one of the reasons I'd gone to find a house of my own somewhere else. I didn't hear from my parents very much. I missed them, but I didn't hear from them. I wanted to tell them I had children. And then I got pregnant again, and by this time my business was doing really well, but the abuse was getting worse. The abuse was things like verbal abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse, a lot of pushing down the stairs, a lot of holding me by the throat and saying that I was causing him problems and I'm the common factor in my life that's a problem. And I believed all of these things naturally because I thought I was a problem. I did my best to mother my children with integrity and grace. I sent them to an independent school. I lived in a really nice area, very affluent area, and nobody went without. If anybody went without, it was me, but that was my idea of my own worth because I didn't believe I had any self-worth. I got pregnant again very shortly after my second child, and my partner was angry about this. And when I was 8.5 months pregnant, he got into an argument with me on the stairs and pushed me, and I ended up in the hospital. Giving birth to my third child, Tyler, who died shortly after he was born in my arms. I didn't have anyone to turn to. The consultant repeatedly asked me if something was wrong, and I said no, because you almost protect your abuser. For some reason, you have this dedication almost, and you believe that you have to look after them, even though you know that they're treating you so badly. And I had this plan in my head that when the children went to university, I'd leave or something, but I fell into a very depressive state. I couldn't work, and I was running the businesses. I couldn't mother, I couldn't do anything. And then I did get pregnant again, and when I got pregnant this time, my partner said he would no longer sleep with me and he would sleep in a separate room because he's seeing other people, which I suspected. I had a beautiful boy. He's my third child. He almost gave me a rebirth as such, and life carried on. I threw myself into work and my children and carried on building this empire so that maybe I could one day say to my father, look, I've done really well, just as well as the boys. But the abuse at home was getting to a point where my daughter was stepping in. She'd gone to university and said, she'd gone to university and started to see that the behaviour was very wrong in her home life and questioned her father. So my partner at the time stopped me speaking to my daughter, and I had no way of communicating with her. And my middle son, he started to stand up to his father saying that, you know, you shouldn't hurt her, you shouldn't push her, you shouldn't hit her. And he got hit. And my solution back then was, I will send him to a boarding school where my other son can go, instead of dealing with the real problem, which was, you know, my abusive partner. By sending him away, I instilled some trauma to him because he was suddenly taken from his family life, put into boarding at the age of 16 in a strange place up north. And as much as it was a beautiful place to be, it's not where he wanted to be because he was constantly worrying. And it caused him abandonment issues and poor mental health, which he still struggles with. My youngest son developed Crohn's disease, and everything changed in his life with his sports and school. When we returned from hospital, my daughter received a text message, a picture message of myself asleep, and her brother was slumped on a table. She knew there was something wrong because I didn't sleep, because my ex-partner had set my pillow on fire twice. Once he'd set the pillow on fire, the other time my hair had set alight and I could smell the burning hair smell, which woke me up. Once she had put the pillow out. So she knew that something was seriously wrong for me to be sleeping. My partner would lock us in our bedrooms at 11 o'clock at night and reopen the doors at 5, which caused me great concern and panic attacks. I couldn't, she tried to ring me that day because the message said, I'm sorry. and she couldn't get hold of me. And in the end, she woke me up by calling all of the landlines. And I answered one of them, but my throat was very dry. When I went to the kitchen, I realised he'd turned on all of the cooker taps, so the house was full of gas. And it was just waiting to either explode or for the carbon monoxide to take some sort of effect on our health. To cut a long story short, we became homeless 6 years ago because we were removed from that situation and placed into emergency care. The emergency house was provided by the council, and I left home with just my coat and my son's hand in mine. We didn't have time to take anything, and the house that they put us into was a flat. It was in Lutterworth in Leicestershire. The walls were smeared with human feces from maybe a young child trying to empty his or her nappy. The floor was sodden with human urine, and the stench was very strong that it got to the back of your throat. So I went from being removed from a comfortable home, which was my home, with my things, my comforts, to going into a place where there was nothing, a bare bed, meters that I didn't understand how they worked. A lady from Women's Aid came who was a very young girl who had just come out of university and had no experience of her own with domestic violence or understanding. And it's not something people teach you in textbooks, so I ended up looking after her almost. And she explained to me that because my situation was such that I had a lot of property in my name and businesses in my name, that the government couldn't help me, which meant that we couldn't stay there and we became homeless. I do believe in angels, as I've said, and a lady from the school had worked out there was something very wrong with my life. And she came forward to say that we could stay in her home. I'm not very good at accepting help, because when you've never had it, it feels very alien to you when someone reaches out to say, let me help you. You instinctively say no. But I knew that I had to do something for my youngest son. And she helped me by letting me stay in her house for a whole month. I cooked for people, I cleaned for people, I did people's accounting, I did all sorts of things, packing in factories, just to save enough money so that I could get a place of my own, which is what we did. And from there, I started to understand that the children had been affected hugely by the domestic violence they had witnessed and the actions of their father. We ended up moving over 400 miles away from Leicestershire because of the non-molestation orders. They said that they couldn't keep giving them to me, and my partner was trying to find me, and still, if he did find me, he would bully me, I guess. He was allowed to talk to me, but the non-molestation order meant he couldn't hurt me, but the threats and the fear that he was instilling were crippling. And when I moved a couple of years ago, I took a really deep sigh of relief, because suddenly I was away from everything I'd ever known. I was away from all of the perpetrators. I was away from fear almost. And I decided, because I'm very spiritual and I do a lot of grounding work, which is when you stand on the grass without shoes and allow Mother Nature to heal you. I discovered that everything I'd been taught was somebody else's opinion of who I was, that being a girl is a disadvantage, being Asian is a disadvantage, being me was not worth anything, whereas it really was worth so much. And I decided that I'd forgive everybody that had ever hurt me, and that I would give them love, because I discovered this huge amount of self-love when I decided that I get to decide who I am. I share my story for the reason that people understand that you don't think logically or by a textbook when you are in a situation of fear. Because as I say, that on the other side of fear, there's love, there's freedom. But when you only know fear, you don't think that love or freedom is for you. And freedom is different things for different people. I now am a coach. I'm a mindset coach. I coach UFC fighters and MMA fighters, boxers, elite sports people, because we've all been knocked down in life. We all have to get up, whichever form or shape we do it. And I feel that I foremost understand the trauma that blocks somebody from believing who they are. I work with a non-profit in Nigeria because my children's father is Nigerian, for domestic violence, and also because culturally a lot of men suffer too because they're forced into marriages or into jobs they don't want to do, and they have to do things to please their parents. I work with a non-profit in Zimbabwe. It's a child marriage non-profit. We keep girls in education because girls are married at a very young age, and being a child bride, I support them and do what I can do also. And I'm an activist against human trafficking because one of the things I realised was 20 years after my father had abused me, I had a call and a visit from the police when I was homeless, actually, saying that they wanted a character reference for my father. And the character reference was because he had abducted a 6-year-old girl in Loughborough. The 6-year-old girl was my half sister, but I didn't know that at the time. He had had a relationship with somebody, and he had this affair, and he abducted her to save face. He took her to India and sold her to human traffickers, and he's just come out of prison because abduction is a short-term sentence. The police couldn't prove that she was sold to human traffickers, but having worked now with other human trafficking organisations, I know the school is a front, and the newspapers describe it as a prison for a place where they harvest organs, which is a huge business in the Indian sort of territory, so to speak, that she was left. I am full of love, as I said, and I have started my own non-profit called End Honour Killings. I did it because people would reach out to me for their stories, or somebody like a mother or somebody that they knew, and just to sometimes have someone hear you, see you, it frees you from that place that you had almost trapped yourself, where you go into a dark space when you're feeling down and you hide this. And a lot of people will take these stories to the grave because they feel such stigma and shame. I do have a lot of death threats because I speak out against my culture. I'm not saying I dislike my culture or dislike Indians or Asians. I love my culture, but I don't condone the bad behavior of these cultural crimes that are handed from families to families and generations, to say that having a girl is a bad thing. So I would like to change the dynamics of how people see things, and also to say to people that many people along my journey could have helped me not suffer so much. And whilst I take on my life's lessons as blessings because I can help others, there's somebody out there that I don't want her or him to go through that pain. So with that, if somebody knows a social worker, or they work in a hospital, or they are themselves a police officer, then maybe they can just look behind the obvious and see the signs of somebody needing help without them actually speaking, because it's in those unspoken words that we can really change and help save lives. Thank you. I believe that